This is Tom Salemi. I'm at OIS at ASRS, and I'm being joined by Christy Shaffer, General Partner at Hatteras Venture Partners. Christy, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
You participated in our seed stage panel today, and it's an important topic to talk about. I want to get into Hatteras and what kind of companies you're investing in, but I wanted to find out a bit more about yourself first. How did you find your way into the life sciences?
So after receiving my PhD in pharmacology, I had the opportunity to work for Burroughs Wellcome, which is now part of GlaxoSmithKline.
Sure.
And I had the opportunity to go into clinical research, and I really love the idea of how basic science can be translated into clinical medicine. And that was before the days of the word translational science. But I was able to be a project leader for a number of international programs, including in pulmonary, and really found my way to a startup company a couple of years after joining Burroughs Wellcome. I was recruited to be the first-time employee of Inspire Pharmaceuticals.
You know the name well, yeah.
And it was a lot of fun growing the company from 1 or 2 to over 200. Ultimately, the company was acquired by Merck. But along the way, we started really in pulmonary medicine and branched into ophthalmology later. But the best part about being the CEO of the company ultimately was making it a really great place for scientists to work.
Now I was going to ask about that, but I did first the move from pulmonary to ophthalmology. How did that come about, and how did that come about? What was the catalyst of that?
Sure. Well, it was really interesting. There was a young scientist who had joined also from Burroughs Wellcome named Ben Yerxa. Ben is now the president of Envisia, which is very well known in the ophthalmology space. And Ben realized that the receptors we were working on were also expressed in corneal epithelium. Oh. And he came to me and said, I think it'd be a really interesting project to look at it in the eye. We went to our board. He presented a pretty lengthy presentation with a lot of dollar signs. And at the end of the board meeting, they said, it's too much money. We shouldn't get diverted. I convinced them to let us spend 1/3 of that amount to do some key experiments in rodents, and went to tell Ben in the lab, this is all we have, do what you can. And he conducted some experiments that sure enough led us to really think it was something worthy to pursue. And it led us to our partnership with Santen Pharmaceuticals in Japan. And of course that product ultimately was in fact launched for dry eye patients in Japan years later. So it was an example of a scientist realizing that the broad platform might have applicability beyond the original therapeutic area.
Did you see the opportunity there as well, or were you putting your faith in his judgment?
He had spent a lot of time thinking about it, and he had convinced me that it was worth a couple $100,000, which seems like a lot, but really was not very much to do some key experiments in order to answer that key question. And I take that similar approach now at Hatteras in investing, is that can you spend a relatively small amount of money to answer a key question and find out whether a technology might be worthy of pursuing?
It's failing fast. That's the way to do it,
yes.
Right? Find out what works. Well, at Inspire, now you started off as a bench scientist. You became CEO. Did you see that happening when you were just starting out?
Well, absolutely not. First of all, my position initially was head of clinical because I had been in clinical at Burroughs Wellcome. But regarding being a CEO, absolutely not. The board asked me to be the CEO at least 5 times before I agreed to do it. I felt that I wasn't qualified because I didn't have an MBA. I didn't really have the background to take a company public. But in fact, they convinced me to become the chief operating officer, which sounded a little less frightening. And over the course of the year, they sort of wooed me into realizing that I could become the CEO and was able to believe that I could do it. But I hired a great team around me that knew a lot more than I did on the business front. So it really helped. But having those mentors that believed in me in those early days were really important.
I believe it. And you mentioned the culture. Did you intentionally try to instill that culture? I know it had been voted several times as a best place to work. But what kind of culture did you try to instill as a CEO?
I really borrowed the culture that I had lived in at Burroughs Wellcome, which was a very family-oriented company that really worked hard to help you pursue your dreams in your own professional career, but also took care of you as a family, as part of the Burroughs Wellcome family and part of your own personal family. And so I brought many of those experiences with me And we didn't really intentionally go out to be named a best place to work for scientists, but we put a lot of programs in place that showed our employees that we cared about them, including doing a tremendous amount of community service. And I never turned down an employee that asked me to sponsor some activity that they believed in. And that resulted in us having a very low turnover rate because we were able to both attract and then retain employees.
Terrific. And going back to that investment, that small investment you made in ophthalmology that obviously grew into a huge business, that created Inspire, which I think we talking privately, you said that there's such a broad network, a family of Inspire folks in ophthalmology. What did that grow in? How did you see that growth into the ophthalmology industry? Did you see it getting as big as it was? And what is it like now going to an event like OAS? Do you see a lot of familiar faces?
Well, it's absolutely fantastic coming to the OAS conference. It is so well done, so well organized, and well attended. And yes, it is a bit like an Inspire reunion when I show up here because so many of my colleagues at Inspire went on to, in fact, either lead ophthalmology companies or lead programs, launch ophthalmology products, and or start their own companies. So a few examples are Ben Yerxa, who is at Invisia. There's a team of people at Perion Sciences that just did a big dry eye deal with Shire. In addition, the folks that launched Xydra for dry eye at Shire had been at Inspire in the commercial or the medical affairs group, Reza Hawk and Bob Dempsey. And then Chad Ice, I'm very proud of, who formed his ophthalmic CRO with a number of other Inspire colleagues at Lexitas Pharma that does great clinical monitoring work for a number of companies. And I was very proud of the fact that I served as Chad's first reference for his new little company to do clinical trials, and that first customer was Sarcode.
Wow. Small world after all, huh?
Yes.
So let's talk a bit more about move into second stage of your career, which is investing in Hatteras. How did you move into the venture capital world?
If you had asked me 20 years ago if I would ever be in venture capital, I would have told you absolutely not.
Well, you weren't going to be a CEO either.
Exactly. So this happens
People have to
with
stop
me.
asking that question.
That's right.
Yeah.
And so I had the opportunity because I knew the team at Hatteras. One of the partners was my former board chair at Inspire, so there was the connection again. And I had known the team for quite a while since they had started their initial fund. And during the period of time after I left Inspire and joined Hatteras, I worked on innovation initiatives at the University of North Carolina campus with the chancellor. And as part of that, realized that there truly is this valley of death. And something really had to be done about great science coming out of universities that are not getting translated into clinical medicine. And they just have grants, but they never actually go into the clinic and actually test the concept. And so Hatteras recruited me for about a year and kept coming up with new and different ways to entice me to join them. And they had an idea called Hatteras Discovery, which was something that I would manage, and it was to really invest in maybe 8 to 10 little companies out of academia and try to get them to do the key experiments that would answer the question whether the concept or mechanism of action was valid, and then try to either get them to move into the clinic quickly to test the concept or to fail fast, as you mentioned before. And so 3 of those companies are Clearside Biomedical, which is now public in the ophthalmology space.
Sure.
They got in the clinic within a year of our investment, and I'm chair of that board. Graybug Vision, which is in Redwood City, California, also has labs in Baltimore. Out of Hopkins, another great eye company, about to go in the clinic in the fall, and I'm chair of that board. And then Trefoil Therapeutics, which is a San Diego-based company, which has some really nice funding from the Trend program of NCATS and will be in the clinic in a couple of years. So we've actually had more successes than failures at this point. We've invested across a variety of therapeutic areas, but the whole idea was to help be a bridge from this very early idea to testing the core questions and getting into the clinic so that we can find out if it's really going to help patients or not. That was a very intriguing idea to me, and it wasn't so much about joining a venture firm as it was to help those companies build and form if in fact the concept proved useful.
Do you tie this strategy to that experience at Inspire when you got a third of what you wanted to to at least give it a test?
I hadn't really thought about it until this interview, to be honest. In thinking about it, it's so true.
There's wisdom in it. I mean,
that the couple $100,000 that we were able to obtain from the board that day, after them telling us no, and I had to quickly regroup and think, okay, just give me a bit of money and a couple of months and let's see where we go. That's exactly what we often do with companies. We say we'll give you $500,000. Let's do a key experiment. We'll help you. We'll be on the board. We'll shepherd it along with you. And then if that works out, we'll help you raise more money. We did that with all three of the companies that I've mentioned, or two of the three companies I mentioned, Clearside and Graybug, and Trefoil is still on their first Series A. But we've been able to find a number of like-minded investors to come in early with us in most occasions, if not initially, that next step, once we have proven that experiment, just like Ben did all those years ago.
And if you're unable to give a company $500,000 and you have to say no
Yes.
across the board, how difficult is it? Obviously, you're used to it now, but how difficult is it being the issuer of a no, and what do you do maybe to soften that no?
It's probably the hardest job. The hardest part about my job in the venture world is having to say no a number of times, because we see hundreds of companies a year, and we're only going to invest in maybe 5 to 7. However, what we try to do as a firm is help every company that we see. If we get so far as to have them come in and meet with us and really talk with them in detail, we try to help them with their pitches. We might tell them how to make it a bit more organized. We try to connect them with others that might be interested. Sometimes it's just not a good fit or a good time for the investment. There have been examples of companies that we've said no to for a year, and then a year and a half later we invested because they listened and they went and did the key experiment, or received some government funding that ultimately enabled them to think through their strategy a bit further. So sometimes they're maybes that turn into yeses. A lot of times they're no. But we've maintained, I think, relationship with the people that we've met. And I think that's really important, because you never know when they'll come around with another really great idea that you do want to invest in years later.
And you've invested some, you mentioned 3 ophthalmology companies. Is this just a byproduct of having been Inspire? That's your network, it's geared toward this sector, or is there something about ophthalmology itself that's drawing Hatteras in?
I think it was both. I think what we've learned over the last 5 years is that ophthalmology is a very attractive market. It's growing, and there's tremendous interest in this space, unlike maybe 10, 15 years ago. So we like the fact that the key questions and the key clinical trials can be done with a reasonable amount of money generally. They're not long, expensive trials relative to, say, treatment-resistant depression trials or congestive heart failure trials. So we like the fact that you can test concepts relatively quickly, and the FDA has been pretty good at giving guidance to companies about what their expectations are.
And what do you think is the state of innovation within ophthalmology now? What's your assessment?
I think it's at an all-time high. You know, when I think about first getting into ophthalmology in the late 1990s and where it is today, it's unbelievable. I think in the 90s, most people thought of ophthalmology as maybe artificial tears, maybe Bausch & Lomb, lens products and so forth, and some equipment, but they didn't really think innovation. I think with the intravitreal injections that have occurred and the really innovative treatments that have occurred in terms of preventing or slowing blindness, people are now really seeing that innovation in ophthalmology can truly occur. So there's now gene therapy, there's gene editing, there are so many things that are happening across the board in therapeutic areas, but are now extending into ophthalmology. And I think other companies coming into the space beyond just the big companies has been really impressive. And certainly biotech, big biotech, of course, like Regeneron, really believes in this space. And that's really bolstered and made a more robust, I think, ophthalmology ecosystem.
And just the final question, with innovation at all-time high, funding seems to be questionable, the level of funding. It certainly seems to be dipping, putting a lot of responsibility on seed stage funders, early stage funders like yourselves. What are the biggest challenges you face as an early stage investor in technology?
Because we invest so early, we sometimes have to go it alone for a year or two or more. And what we found in the last couple of years is that more and more investors are coming in to ophthalmology, so that it's easier for us to syndicate early stage deals than before. But that's the biggest challenge, is wondering how long you're going to have to go it alone. But we have now invested with about a dozen new co-investors that we have never invested with before. And as an example, with Graybug, we co-invested after the first seed round with OrbiMed, Claris, and Deerfield. And so
Big names.
Big players,
Yep.
and they like the ophthalmology space, and Emmett Cunningham is on our board. And, I think that times are changing in the space where it's now actually a little bit more competitive in doing deals, and early stage deals, you don't win every deal either. So that's actually a good thing for the entrepreneurs.
I would think it's okay once in a while to miss on one or two.
Right.
Great. Well, thanks for joining us today at the conference and here
Thank
during
you,
the
Tom.
interview.